Hello, we're continuing here with Energy 101, and today we're going to talk about oil imports. We've talked about the resources that we're using in fossil fuels to fuel our energy needs, oil, gas, and coal, and we just finished with oil and how much we use, but we need to look a little closer at the oil imports, because that's one of the biggest reasons that you see energy in the news a lot, is the impact of the oil imports that we're using. This is a chart that we've seen before. I just want to reemphasize the red area is the import over time. These are millions of barrels per day, and you can see the yellow is the lower 48 oil production in barrels per day versus years, and the purple is the Alaska production. And we fortunately turned up here in 2009 and beginning to come up. Our demand is coming up though also a little bit, and this is the import trend itself, and it has dropped, that you hear significant news about. It's dropped from about 10 million barrels a day down to about 9 million barrels per day on our oil imports. You might be surprised that it hasn't dropped more than that when you hear about all the new oil production coming out of North Dakota, for instance, and oil sands and tar sands and things. But there's a big reason why our imports are not going down more than what this graph shows. And that is because existing wells decline their production about 6% every year. So we're producing about 7 million barrels a day, so 6% of that's 400,000 barrels a day that existing wells are decreasing in their production. So to stay in the same place, to produce the same amount of oil, we have to find and get new producing wells of 400,000 to 500,000 barrels a day every year, just to keep our oil production in this country the same. So we have to run hard in order to keep the same place. If we want to make an inroad into the red area here, which are imports, we're going to have to increase our production and drilling activity considerably, because we've got to, as you see, we have to increase at a factor of 2.5 or so our production in order to become independent of oil imports, which we'll look at a little closer. So that's what we're talking about, and previously we've determined that the U.S. is energy independent for coal and gas. Those are the electric power fuel resource that we use, fuels. And so when it comes to electricity, we are energy independent. That's why wind that produces electricity, solar PV that produces electricity, and nuclear that produces electricity does not have an impact on our oil consumption, because we don't burn oil for electricity production. So that's unfortunate, because our renewables, the wind and solar and nuclear, for instance, also would have a big impact on our oil if we were burning oil for electric power, but unfortunately we're not. The U.S. is dependent on imported oil. Approximately 60% of our oil consumption is imported. 60% is imported. So that's where the problem is from an economic and national security viewpoint. So where is this oil coming from? Well, fortunately, the top 2 countries that it's coming from are North American countries. Canada being the biggest one, of about 24% of the oil that we import is coming from Canada. That's followed by Mexico and at about 10%. And unfortunately, Mexico's production rate is declining, and their domestic consumption is generally increasing. So their exports have been declining in recent years. People expect that to happen for a while longer, so the oil that we can import from Mexico is probably going to decline over the next few years. And one of the advantages of getting oil from Canada and Mexico is they're adjoining countries overland, and we can bring the oil in by pipeline. Pipeline is a very cheap way to transport oil, much cheaper than even by ocean tankers. The next in line is Saudi Arabia, the third country, and we get about 10% of our imports from Saudi Arabia. Venezuela at about 8%, Nigeria at about 7%, Russia is 5%. Russia has really brought on and developed their oil resources and increased production considerably in the last 10 years actually, and they are becoming and are a major oil exporter. Iraq is they're up to about 4% now. Colombia and South America, Algeria, Angola, and Brazil, and I left the rest off. They were all less than 2%. So you can see the main countries that we are depending on for our oil imports, which is about 60% of what we use. But Canada and Mexico we don't view as a major problem with those imports, and probably rightfully so. And you can see here that approximately a third of our, when you add Mexico and Canada together, approximately a third of our oil imports come from North America. So those are much less problematic than the ones, the remaining oil importing countries that we're getting our oil from. Outside of North America is about 2/3 of the total oil imports, so that means that about 40% of our oil supplies that we use every day is coming from outside North America, which is, in my mind, probably one of the more important numbers. 40% of the oil we use is coming from outside of North America. The 65% is of the oil that's being imported. So you multiply that times about 60% of the total oil that is imported, and you get about 40% of the oil that we use is coming from outside of North America. Well, why we import from those particular countries is a complicated story, and there's no one factor that determines that. But it's useful to look at the nations of the world that are exporting oil. Saudi Arabia is exporting more oil for sale to other countries than any other nation. At about 21% of the total oil that's exported for purchase on the open market that that is not consumed within the producing countries is coming from Saudi Arabia. Russia is next. I mentioned Russia is becoming a very big player in the world oil market. About 18% of the world's oil that is exported is coming from Russia that's available for purchase. Iran, you can see why Iran is a major player and one that's hot on our radar screen. UAE immigrants, Kuwait, Nigeria, Iraq, Norway, Angola, Venezuela. Venezuela with Chavez, we don't have a very friendly situation with that country. So there are a lot of countries on here that are not necessarily our best friends. And when we choose among these countries about where we're going to get our oil imported from, it's primarily dependent on price. The oil that's imported is bought by private companies like Exxon and Chevron, and they buy the oil from the cheapest source they can get it. Whoever can deliver it to their refinery at the least cost is where they get their oil from and where they'll purchase it from. So it's price that primarily determines. And of course, their price to their dock is determined by how far it has to be shipped. So Canada and Mexico have an advantage in that it doesn't have to be shipped very far, so there's less shipping cost. So that helps them and hurts the countries that have to ship it by ocean tanker. So that's the available oil supply on the market. And by the way, one interesting thing, there's a significant percentage of the oil is pumped out, put on a tanker, and the tanker is in the middle of the ocean before it's actually sold. So people don't really care, but corporations, big companies don't really care where the oil's coming from. If there's a tanker out there that'll sell it to them cheaper than somebody else and anybody else, that's where they'll get it from. So there are obviously some long-term contracts too, but the last barrel that's sold is on the margin is the one that determines the price of oil. And we'll talk about that more. So we see that Saudi Arabia is producing the largest amount of oil on the world market for export, and I think it's interesting that they are actually producing more oil than we're producing. They're producing about 10 million barrels a day, and we're producing about 7 million barrels a day. And in order to get that 7 million barrels a day, we right now have about 1,400 oil rigs that are actively drilling for oil. That's an interesting number, 1,400, that's a lot of rigs. Guess what Saudi Arabia has? Well, as shown there, is 50 rigs to get more oil than we are getting. They're producing 10 million barrels a day with 50 active drilling rigs compared to 1,400 rigs in which we're producing only 7. And this is fairly consistent over time. We've explored our country for 100 years now for oil, and it's similar to the analogy I like to use. It's like you got it's like you got volleyballs and ping pong balls buried in the sand on the beach, and each one of them has oil in it, and you go around with a stick looking for oil, and you're going to find the volleyballs first, and when you find one, it's going to have a lot of oil. But now we've basically found all the volleyballs, so now we're looking for ping pong balls. They're harder to find, and it's harder to get it out, and we get a lot less oil for all the effort. So that's why we have so many rigs that actively looking for oil. So we are trying. It's not for the lack of trying. So conclusions, the U.S. imports are about 40% of oil from outside North America. Much of this oil comes from unfriendly, unstable countries. And the issues are economic impact of that imported oil. That's $1 billion a day of imported oil. We're sending $1 billion a day out of this country for oil. That's a huge economic impact, has impact on jobs, on the economy, on people's personal bank account, etc. And the other one is, of course, national security. And we learned about that in spades in the 70s when OPEC decided to embargo us and wouldn't sell us any oil. And I lived through that, and it wasn't a very good time, because when we just don't have any alternatives when people won't sell us oil and we can't get enough. We really don't have any short-time alternatives to trying to solve that problem. Thank you.